So, part two of our week three discussion around the topic of congruency is going to give you an opportunity to think about what we've learned about congruency and how to apply that to actual practice. So, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be analyzing the quality of some actual formative assessments that have been used in classrooms, and we're going to take a look to see if they are congruent with the lesson's learning target. So we've talked about congruency in terms of standards, but we can also think about congruency within a lesson. So congruency builds with the progression of learning targets towards the standard as a whole. And similarly, congruency also builds within a particular lesson to congruency with the learning target for the day. And if we're ensuring that each day that we are congruent with the learning target for that day, then we can ensure that we're building to the level over time where we get to congruency with the entire standard. So as we take a look at some different examples of formative assessments, we're going to be looking and thinking about two guiding questions. The first one is we're going to take a look at the formative assessment to see if it's congruent with the learning targets. We're going to take a look at a target, take a look at the formative assessment that goes along with it, and make some decisions about the congruency of that. And then the second thing we're going to consider is if that formative assessment task is the best choice to measure student mastery of the learning target, because there's different ways to measure and assess student mastery and learning. So the first example that we're going to take a look at is an example from a fourth grade reading class. So for this one, I'm going to start by really modeling and doing some thinking aloud. So I want you to listen and pay attention to my thought processes and types of questions that I'm asking and answering myself about congruency. And then how do I come to a conclusion about congruency? So the learning target for this lesson says I can explain my inferences using evidence. Before I even look at the formative assessment, I want to just think about what that learning target says and what it means, because the learning target is really going to tell you what it wants in terms of student mastery. So when I take a look at it a little deeper, I notice that it says my inferences. It doesn't just say an inference, it says my inferences. So what that means is that students are at the point in the learning progression where they should be expected to make their own inferences. It also uses the verb explain. So students should be expected to explain something. Now, what is that something they're supposed to explain? The target states that they need to explain their own inferences using evidence. And if you know fourth grade, which you might not, but if you know fourth grade standards or take a look at fourth grade standards, what we're actually thinking about in terms of evidence with fourth grade is textual evidence. So evidence that is explicit in the text that can be used to support their inferences. So I'm going to think about what that means in terms of a formative assessment. That means that if I am thinking about the best way for students to demonstrate mastery, then that means they're going to have to read something. They're going to have to make an inference about it. And then they're going to have to explain why they made that inference by including some sort of textual evidence to support their inferences in that explanation that they write. So now I'm going to take a look at the actual formative assessment, the task that the teacher is asking the students to do. And I'm going to tackle that first guiding question, which is the formative assessment congruent with the learning target? The students were given a Post-it note, and according to the instructions, they were to write their inference and then use the rest of the space on the Post-it note to write textual evidence, schema, or background knowledge. So I'm first going to think about the verb in the target, which is explain, and see if the students were asked to explain anything. So when I think about what they were actually asked to do, they were asked to make an inference and then to write either textual evidence, schema, and or background knowledge. That's really not an explanation. That's more of a list rather than an explanation. So automatically, I can say that this task isn't congruent to the verb in the learning target because listing is a lower skill level than explaining. And so what this task is asking students to do is actually much simpler and not at the level at which the target is written. So it's not going far enough. The target does state that they need to make their own inference, and the assessment does require them to do that. So that part is good and it's aligned. It just doesn't go far enough. So my other question is, where does schema or background knowledge come in? The target specifically mentions evidence, and I No, that means textual evidence. So background knowledge and schema are really just extra extraneous pieces of information that we really don't need for this particular assessment. It muddies the water a little bit in terms of me being able to tell if students can actually explain inferences using evidence. So overall, my conclusion is that this formative assessment is not congruent because it doesn't require students to actually explain anything, and it only requires them to make an inference and list some related evidence. So now I want to think about the second guiding question, which asks if this is the best choice to measure student mastery of the learning target. And in this case, since the target wasn't congruent, it's automatically not the best match. I'm not sure they can get a full explanation on a post it note, and that actually plants some unintentional misconceptions in the students' brains. So when I tell them that they're going to be able to explain their inferences and that I expect them to explain their inferences, and then I hand them a post it note, then automatically in their brain, they're thinking, oh, a good explanation can fit on a post it note. And that's just not true. And so we're not giving them the right format to be able to even demonstrate mastery of this particular learning target. So the teacher may want to consider a different means for assessing this particular target. That said, there's nothing wrong with this particular task in and of itself. I like the task by itself, but when you put it with the particular target that it's supposed to be assessing, you can see that it's not a good match. This better fits with a target about locating and listing related evidence, which is further back in the learning progression. And again, if you have the target up saying that this is what you're going to be doing today in class, then students should be at the point where they can actually do that. So it just doesn't get to the level required by the particular target. All right, so that's an example of what you would be thinking about as you try to determine whether or not the assessments and the targets are actually aligned. What we want to make sure is that we are collecting the right kind of information to know if students have mastered the target or not. And in a situation like this, what we're going to wind up with is some faulty data because students might actually do very well on this particular assessment, but I still don't have any information to know if they've actually mastered the learning target that was actually the objective for the lesson today. We want to make sure that we have as direct and congruent of a match as possible so that we're getting the right kind of information and the right kind of data about student learning. Let's look at another example. This is an example from a fifth grade social studies class. You can see the learning target, which says I can use a map to identify major landforms and bodies of water. So when I take a look at this, I'll actually go ahead and let you know that this is a task or a target that is at the very end of the learning progression, and students are actually almost at the point where they're ready to take a summative assessment. So they're getting much more complex with their knowledge because remember, congruency and standards are really complex. So as we build in those learning progressions, we're going to be building in the complexity of what we're asking students to do. So before I look too closely at the task itself, I want to really think about that learning target and ask that learning target to speak to me. So first of all, it says that I can use a map to identify major landforms and bodies of water. We've got two verbs in there. We've got the verb use and we've got the verb identify. So they're using a map, but they're identifying landforms and bodies of water. So without really looking at the task too much, I just need to think in my head and or go back and refer to the standards documents to find out what we're asking. Landforms are things like mountains and plateaus and islands and peninsulas and things like that. Bodies of water are things like oceans, rivers, streams, gulfs, those different types of things. So they encompass much more than what this particular learning task is getting at. So if I take a look at the actual learning task itself, the students are really asked to match up oceans and continents with locations that are identified with a letter. So matching is not anywhere close to the same level as identifying landforms and bodies of water. So this is really not a congruent task. So when I think about what I would expect a formative assessment to look like, what would I need to have for students to be able to show me that they can use a map and identify major landforms and bodies of water with some level of mastery? Well, first of all, this type of map is what I need because I can't really see landforms and bodies of water on this other than just the very, very basics. So I would probably need to use some sort of topographical or physical map to be able to give the students the right kind of map to be able to even be successful on that target. Once I do that, then I would think about how do I need them to identify all of the different major landforms and the bodies of water, or as many of them as they can. So I need to be able to have them do that in some form. Matching is not the way to do that because matching is not telling me if they can identify those things. So what I probably need to think about doing is this would be a great opportunity to pull out those post-it notes. And they could take post-it notes and label mountains and put it on the mountains. And then they could label ocean and put it on an ocean. And then they could label plateau and put it on a plateau. And then we could even do a little bit of verbal assessment where they're asking them to explain, well, why did you put that post-it note there for a mountain? How do you know those are mountains? How do you know those are plateaus? How do you know that's an ocean? And then they can use their knowledge to be able to really tell you. So in this instance, this particular task is not the best task, nor is it congruent with the learning target. It just doesn't go far enough and it doesn't get to the cognitive level that it needs to. So let's look at one final example. This is an example from a first grade math class. And I'll start out by saying, don't let the words in the learning target scare you. If you've ever worked with young kids before, or if you haven't, you might be surprised to know that they are like little sponges when it comes to words. And so they don't know what the word attribute means when we start out, but by the time we finish, they are absolutely able to use that word because we're talking to them about it. So first of all, we don't want to be afraid of using the words that are in the standards with our students, no matter the age level. So that said, this particular learning target talks about explaining the differences between defining attributes, which are sides, faces, and angles, and non-defining attributes, which are color, orientations, and overall size. So that's a lot of things, but first graders really are able to handle this. Um, so the directions tell the teacher to cut out and laminate the shape cards that they're going to be using with the students. And then this is a verbal assessment. So they're going to be sitting in front of the student and they're going to be holding up the card and they're going to, according to the directions, ask the students to identify two defining attributes of the shape. So I'll ask you, take a moment to think about, is this actually congruent? And I think it's pretty easy to see automatically that it is getting at what the target is asking, but it doesn't go far enough because it stops with the identification of defining attributes. And the target says that students also need to be identifying non-defining attributes and then explaining the difference between those. So in this instance, what I would ask the teacher to do to make it congruent is just to add some additional questions. So you've asked them to identify two defining, now ask them to identify some non-defining, and then just ask them to explain the difference. How did you know the difference between those? And then they can talk a little bit about that. And just by adding a simple question or two, we can turn this learning target, or I'm sorry, this formative assessment, which is not congruent in the learning target, we can make it congruent very easily. So obviously that has some implications for look fors during observations and feedback conversations as an administrator. When we go in poised to think about, is this a direct match and is this instruction and are we assessing students at the level that that the target is written at, it helps us to think more thoroughly about the rigor and the expectations and the types of data that we're collecting in our classroom. So throughout our conversation about congruency, we've now defined the difference between congruency and alignment, and you've been given the opportunity to analyze the quality of some formative assessments to determine if they are congruent with the lesson's learning target.